The small town of Maplewood was buzzing with excitement. It was the kind of day where everyone seemed to have a smile on their face, and the streets were alive with chatter. The local church had been decorated beautifully for Sarah Thompson's wedding to James Carter, a man who had swept her off her feet just 2 years earlier. For Sarah, this day was supposed to mark a fresh start, a chance to build a happy family with the man she loved and her 10-year-old son, Ethan. Sarah had always been a strong woman, raising Ethan on her own after his father left when he was just a baby. Life hadn't been easy for her, but she never let it show. She worked hard at the bakery downtown, baking delicious pies and cakes that made people's faces light up. Her warmth and kindness made her one of the most beloved people in town. When James came into her life, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. He was charming, successful, and seemed genuinely interested in being part of both Sarah's and Ethan's lives. Ethan, however, wasn't so sure about James. On the surface, he appeared to be a happy kid, always polite, good at school, and well-liked by his classmates. But those closest to him knew there was something different about him lately. He'd become quieter, spending hours alone in his room sketching pictures or scribbling in a notebook. Sometimes Sarah would peek inside and see pages filled with random thoughts and doodles, but nothing that gave her much insight into what was going on in his mind. That morning, as Sarah got ready for her big day, Ethan sat quietly by the window, staring outside. In his hand, he clutched a folded piece of paper tightly, as if it held some secret too heavy for him to bear. His heart raced every time he thought about what might happen later that day. He wanted to believe that James was the wonderful man. Everyone said he was the man his mom deserved, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As guests began arriving at the church, laughter echoed through the halls. Children ran around playing tag while adults exchanged hugs and greetings. The air smelled of fresh flowers and sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. Everything looked perfect, almost like a scene from a fairy tale. Yet Ethan felt anything but calm. He watched as his mother walked gracefully toward the altar, her white dress flowing behind her, her eyes shining with hope. She looked beautiful, happier than he'd seen her in a long time. Standing beside her as the ring bearer, Ethan tried to focus on the moment. He reminded himself that today was about making his mom happy. But the weight of the note in his pocket wouldn't let him forget what he knew. Every time James smiled at him, Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He didn't want to ruin the day, but he also couldn't ignore the truth. As the pastor began speaking, Ethan's hands started to tremble. He glanced at the crowd, then back at James, wondering if anyone else could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface. Little did they know, the events of this day would change all their lives forever. The church was alive with energy as the ceremony began. Soft music played in the background, and the scent of fresh flowers lingered in the air. Sarah stood at the altar, her hands gently resting on the bouquet of white roses she held. Her eyes sparkled with happiness as she gazed at James, who stood across from her, looking every bit the picture of a loving groom. The guests whispered quietly among themselves, commenting on how perfect the couple seemed together. To anyone watching, this was a match made in heaven, a second chance at love for Sarah and a bright future for Ethan. Ethan stood near his mother, dressed neatly in his suit. He looked older than his 10 years, but there was a tension in his posture that no one seemed to notice. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his jacket, and his eyes darted between his mom and James. Occasionally, he would glance down at the pocket where the folded note lay hidden, his heart pounding faster each time he thought about what it contained. Despite his outward calm, Ethan's mind was racing. He tried to focus on the moment, reminding himself that today was supposed to be special, a day of joy and celebration. But the weight of the secret he carried made it hard to breathe. James, meanwhile, seemed completely at ease. He smiled warmly at Sarah, occasionally nodding politely at the pastor's words. When his gaze fell on Ethan, he gave him an encouraging wink as if to say, "We're going to be a great family." On the surface, it was a reassuring gesture, but to Ethan it felt like a silent warning. Every smile, every kind word, it all felt like a mask hiding something darker underneath. Ethan swallowed hard, trying not to let his emotions show. He didn't want to upset his mom or ruin the day, but the longer the ceremony went on, the harder it became to stay quiet. As the pastor continued speaking, the atmosphere grew more solemn. The vows were about to begin, and the congregation leaned forward slightly in anticipation. Sarah took a deep breath, her voice steady as she prepared to speak her promises to James. She believed this was the start of a new chapter, a life filled with love, stability, and happiness for both her and Ethan. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His stomach churned as he listened to the pastor's words, each sentence pulling him closer to a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. Outside, the sun shone brightly, casting golden rays through the stained glass windows. Birds chirped cheerfully in the distance, oblivious to the turmoil brewing inside the young boy. Ethan's thoughts raced as he weighed his options. Should he stay silent and let the wedding go on? Or should he step forward and reveal the truth he'd been carrying? He glanced at his mom, her face glowing with hope, and then at James, whose expression remained calm and confident. For a brief moment, Ethan wished he could disappear, run away from the church and never have to face what came next. But deep down, he knew he couldn't do that. This wasn't just about him. It was about protecting his mom. As much as he wanted to believe that James was the man everyone thought he was, the evidence told a different story. And now, standing here in the middle of the ceremony, Ethan realized he might be the only person who could stop it from going any further. The question was whether he had the courage to act, and what price they would all pay once the truth came out. As the pastor paused to allow James to begin his vows, a sudden movement caught everyone's attention. Ethan, who had been standing quietly near his mother, took a hesitant step forward. At first, no one understood what was happening. The guests exchanged puzzled glances, unsure whether this was part of the ceremony or some unplanned moment. But when Ethan moved closer to the altar, his small frame trembling slightly, the atmosphere in the church shifted. "Ethan, sweetheart, what are you doing?" Sarah whispered, her voice soft but laced with confusion. She reached out instinctively as if to pull him back to his place. But Ethan didn't stop. His eyes were fixed on James, and though his hands shook, his expression was determined. He held something tightly in his fist, a folded piece of paper that looked worn from being clutched too long. The murmurs in the church grew louder, and even the pastor paused mid-sentence, unsure how to proceed. James, who had been smiling warmly just moments before, now looked uneasy. His brow furrowed as he watched Ethan approach him, his confident demeanor faltering for the first time that day. "Ethan, buddy, what's going on?" he asked, forcing a chuckle as if to downplay the situation. But Ethan didn't laugh. Instead, he extended the crumpled note toward James, his voice cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. "You need to read this," Ethan said firmly, his words clear and unwavering despite the nerves evident in his stance. The room fell deathly quiet, every eye turning to James as he hesitated, staring at the note in Ethan's hand. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might refuse, but the weight of the crowd's gaze, and perhaps the intensity in Ethan's eyes, forced him to take it. Slowly, reluctantly, James unfolded the paper, his fingers trembling slightly as he did so. Sarah, still holding her bouquet, stepped forward, her face pale with concern. "What is this, Ethan? What's going on?" she asked, her voice rising with emotion. Her son didn't answer immediately, his focus entirely on James as the man began to scan the contents of the note. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some leaning forward to get a better view, others whispering nervously among themselves. James's expression changed rapidly as he read the words scrawled on the paper. His initial look of confusion gave way to shock, then guilt, and finally, a flicker of fear. He glanced up at Ethan, then at Sarah, his lips parting as if to say something, but no words came out. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until finally someone in the audience coughed, breaking the spell. Ethan stood there, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his courage unwavering despite the chaos unfolding around him. He knew this moment would change everything, for his mom, for James, and most importantly, for himself. Whatever happened next, he had done what he believed was right. And as the congregation waited anxiously for James to speak, one thing was certain: nothing about this wedding would ever be the same again. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of the paper as James held the note in his hands. Every eye was fixed on him, waiting for some kind of explanation. Sarah's face had gone pale, her fingers clutching the bouquet so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She stared at James, her eyes wide with confusion and fear, searching for any sign that this was all just a misunderstanding. But James didn't meet her gaze. Instead, he kept his eyes glued to the crumpled note, his expression shifting between shock, guilt, and something darker, something that made Ethan's stomach churn. Finally, James looked up, his voice shaky, as he tried to speak. This isn't what it looks like," he stammered, though his words lacked conviction. He glanced at Ethan, who stood firmly by the altar, his small frame radiating an unexpected strength. Then he turned to Sarah, forcing a weak smile. "Ethan must have misunderstood something. I don't know where this is coming from." But Ethan wasn't about to let him brush it off. Taking a deep breath, he spoke up, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "It's not a misunderstanding," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I found messages on your phone. You've been talking to someone else, a woman, and when I asked you about it, you told me not to tell Mom or there would be trouble." His words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, cutting through James's feeble attempts to defend himself. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she processed what Ethan was saying. Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned to James, her voice trembling. "Is this true? Tell me it's not true," she pleaded, desperation creeping into her tone. The man she had trusted, the man she was ready to spend the rest of her life with, now seemed like a stranger standing before her. James opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked around the church, meeting the accusing stares of the guests. Some were whispering angrily, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A few people even stood up, unable to sit quietly while the truth unfolded. One elderly woman muttered, under her breath, "How could he do this?" While a young couple exchanged horrified glances, Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger as he found courage in the support of those around him. "You told me you'd take away my games and make things hard for Mom if I said anything, but I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Not today. Not when it's supposed to be about love." His words struck a chord with everyone in the room. Even the pastor, who had remained silent until now, looked visibly moved, his hands clasped tightly together as he watched the scene unfold. Sarah's tears began to fall freely now, streaming down her cheeks as the weight of Ethan's revelation sank in. She reached out to grab James's arm, demanding answers. "Why? Why would you do this to us?" she cried, her voice breaking. James flinched, unable to look her in the eyes, and for the first time, the charming facade he had carefully maintained crumbled, revealing the cracks beneath. As the congregation absorbed the shocking turn of events, the once happy ceremony transformed into something raw and painful. The beautiful decorations, the soft music, the carefully planned details, all of it suddenly felt hollow. What had started as a celebration of love had become a reckoning, exposing the lies that had nearly destroyed a family. And at the center of it all stood Ethan, a boy who had risked everything to protect his mother, even if it meant shattering the illusion of perfection. The air in the church was thick with tension, and the silence that followed Ethan's revelation felt suffocating. James, still holding the note in his trembling hands, tried desperately to regain control of the situation. "It's not what you think," he said again, his voice louder this time but tinged with panic. He looked at Sarah, pleading with his eyes, as if hoping she would somehow believe him over her own son. "Yes, I made a mistake, I admit it. But it doesn't mean I don't love you. I was confused, stressed. I never meant for things to go this far." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face as she took a step back from him. "A mistake?" she echoed, her voice rising with disbelief. You lied to me, James. You manipulated my son. How could you do that? How could you stand here today promising forever when you were already breaking us apart? Her words struck a chord with the guests, many of whom began murmuring angrily among themselves. Some stood up, their faces red with indignation. An older man near the front row pointed a finger at James and shouted, How dare you treat this family like this? That boy trusted you. Others nodded in agreement, their sympathetic gazes shifting between Sarah and Ethan. The atmosphere had shifted completely, from joyous celebration to raw confrontation. James stumbled over his words, trying to explain himself, but no one was listening anymore. Even the pastor stepped aside, his expression grave as he watched the unraveling scene. Sarah turned to Ethan, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. Her voice softened as she spoke to him, though her pain was still evident. Why didn't you tell me sooner, sweetheart? You should have come to me. Ethan hesitated, his lower lip quivering slightly. I wanted to, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But he scared me, Mom. He said if I told anyone, he'd make things harder for us. I didn't want you to get hurt. His confession only deepened the ache in Sarah's heart. She pulled him into a tight hug, stroking his hair as she whispered, You protected me, baby. I'm so proud of you. Meanwhile, James grew more desperate, his polished demeanor crumbling under the weight of the accusations. Please, Sarah, let's talk about this later, he implored, glancing nervously at the crowd. Not here. Not now. We can work through this together. But Sarah wasn't having it. She stood up, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, and faced him squarely. No, James. There's nothing left to work through. This ends here. The congregation erupted into chaos. People began filing out of their seats, some rushing to console Sarah, others confronting James directly. A few women hugged Ethan, praising his bravery and assuring him that he had done the right thing. Reporters who had gathered outside the church for what was supposed to be a joyful event now pushed closer, snapping photos and jotting notes as whispers of scandal spread like wildfire. As the argument escalated, Sarah finally reached her breaking point. Clutching Ethan's hand tightly, she turned away from James and marched toward the exit. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they watched the bride walk out of her own wedding, leaving James standing alone at the altar. His shoulders slumped, in defeat, the weight of his actions crashing down on him as reality set in. For the first time, he realized there was no coming back from this, not after betraying the trust of the two people who mattered most. Outside, the sunlight bathed the courtyard in golden hues, a stark contrast to the storm inside the church. As Sarah and Ethan stepped into the fresh air, they were greeted by flashes of cameras and shouts from reporters. But neither of them cared. They had faced the truth together, and though the road ahead would be difficult, they knew they had each other, and sometimes that was all that mattered. The days following the wedding that never happened were a blur of emotions for Sarah and Ethan. The story had spread like wildfire through Maplewood, with everyone talking about what had unfolded in the church. Neighbors who had once admired James now shook their heads in disappointment, while others praised Sarah for her strength and Ethan for his courage. Reporters camped outside their home, eager to get a statement or snap another photo. But Sarah kept the curtains drawn and focused on protecting her son from the chaos. At first, Sarah struggled to process everything. She spent hours sitting at the kitchen table staring at the note Ethan had written, the same note that had exposed James's betrayal. Her mind replayed every conversation, every smile, every promise James had made, trying to piece together how she could have missed the signs. It was painful to admit, but deep down she knew Ethan had been right all along. There had been moments when something felt off, times when James seemed distant or overly defensive, but she had brushed it aside, convincing herself it was nothing. Now those doubts weighed heavily on her heart. Ethan, too, was dealing with his own storm of feelings. While many people called him brave, he couldn't shake the guilt of ruining what was supposed to be his mom's happiest day. He replayed the scene in the church over and over in his mind, wondering if there had been another way to handle things. But whenever he saw the relief in his mom's eyes, he reminded himself that he had done the right thing, even if it hurt. "You saved me, Ethan," Sarah told him one evening as they sat together on the couch. "I might not have seen the truth without you." Slowly, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Without James around, Sarah found herself rediscovering parts of her life she had neglected. She threw herself into her work at the bakery, experimenting with new recipes and reconnecting with old friends. For the first time in years, she started painting again, a hobby she had abandoned after Ethan's father left. The vibrant colors and creative freedom brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Ethan noticed the change in her and smiled, happy to see his mom finding joy again. For Ethan, school became a welcome distraction. His classmates initially bombarded him with questions about the wedding, but their curiosity eventually faded, replaced by admiration for his bravery. Teachers commended him for standing up for what was right, and even the principal invited him to speak at an assembly about honesty and integrity. At first, Ethan was nervous about sharing his story publicly, but with his mom's encouragement, he agreed. Standing in front of the auditorium, he spoke candidly about the importance of speaking up, even when it's hard. By the end, the entire room erupted in applause, leaving Ethan beaming with pride. As weeks turned into months, Sarah and Ethan grew closer than ever. They talked openly about their feelings, sharing fears and hopes they had kept bottled up before. Sarah made a conscious effort to listen more, to truly hear what Ethan was saying, and Ethan in turn felt safer opening up to her. Their bond became unshakable, a source of strength for both of them during difficult times. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Sarah turned to Ethan and said, "We're going to be okay. You know that, right? No matter what happens, we'll always have each other." Ethan nodded, leaning his head against her shoulder. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the evening, they realized something important. Sometimes endings can lead to new beginnings. And while the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, they were ready to face it together. Months had passed since the dramatic events of the wedding, and life in Maplewood had begun to return to its usual rhythm. The initial buzz surrounding Sarah and Ethan's story had faded, though occasional whispers still lingered in coffee shops and grocery store aisles. For Sarah and Ethan, however, the focus was no longer on what had happened, but on building a future filled with hope and healing. Sarah threw herself into creating a stable, loving environment for Ethan. She enrolled him in art classes after noticing how much he enjoyed drawing during his quiet moments at home. To her delight, Ethan thrived under the guidance of his teacher, producing colorful sketches and paintings that told stories of resilience and courage. Some of his artwork even made it onto the walls of the local community center, earning praise from neighbors who admired his talent and determination. Seeing her son blossom brought Sarah immense joy, reminding her of the importance of nurturing his passions. But Sarah didn't stop there. Inspired by Ethan's bravery, she decided to use her experience to help others. She began volunteering at a nearby family support group, where she shared her story and offered advice to parents navigating difficult situations. Many were touched by her honesty and vulnerability, especially when she spoke about the challenges of co-parenting alone and the importance of listening to children. "Kids see more than we give them credit for," she often said. "They may not always have the words to express themselves, but their actions speak volumes." Ethan also found ways to channel his emotions into meaningful action. With his mom's encouragement, he joined a youth mentorship program at school where older students helped younger ones adjust to new environments and overcome personal struggles. Ethan quickly became a favorite among the kids, known for his kindness and ability to relate to their fears and insecurities. He never shied away from talking about his own experiences, using them as examples to show others that it was okay to speak up when something felt wrong. His teachers marveled at how much he had grown, not just as a student but as a leader. Together, Sarah and Ethan turned their shared pain into purpose. They started hosting small workshops at the community center, focusing on open communication between parents and children. These sessions were simple yet powerful, filled with discussions, role-playing exercises, and heartfelt conversations. Families left feeling inspired and equipped with tools to strengthen their bonds. It wasn't long before word spread about the positive impact these workshops were having, drawing participants from neighboring towns. One chilly Saturday morning, as Sarah prepared for another session, Ethan walked into the kitchen holding one of his latest drawings. It depicted two figures standing side by side holding hands with a bright sun rising behind them. "I call it New Beginnings," he said shyly, handing it to her. Sarah studied the picture, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she replied, pulling him into a tight hug. "Just like us." That evening, as they sat together watching the stars twinkle in the night sky, Sarah reflected on how far they'd come. The scars of the past would always remain, but they no longer defined them. Instead, they served as reminders of their strength and resilience. Through everything, they had leaned on each other, proving that love and trust could conquer even the hardest trials. As Ethan drifted off to sleep that night, Sarah tucked him in, kissing his forehead gently. "You're my hero, you know that?" she whispered. Ethan smiled, his voice drowsy but full of warmth. "And you're mine, Mom." In that moment, surrounded by the comfort of their little home, they knew they had built something unbreakable. Partnership rooted in truth, understanding, and unconditional love. And no matter what lay ahead, they faced it together, ready to embrace whatever life had in store. A year had passed since the day Ethan stood at the altar and changed everything. Maplewood had moved on, but Sarah and Ethan's story remained etched in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. What started as a tale of betrayal and heartbreak had transformed into a story of courage, healing, and resilience, a testament to the power of truth and family. Sarah's life looked different now. The bakery where she worked had become more than just a job. It was a place where she connected with people, sharing laughter and stories over freshly baked pies and warm bread. Her paintings, once hidden away in a dusty corner of the attic, now adorned the walls of local galleries. People admired not only her talent but also the emotions behind each brushstroke: hope, pain, joy, and triumph. Sarah had found a new sense of purpose, one that allowed her to embrace both her past and her future. Ethan, too, had grown in ways no one could have predicted. His artwork continued to inspire others, earning him recognition beyond Maplewood. One of his pieces, a vibrant painting titled Courage, was featured in a statewide youth art exhibition. Standing beside his mom at the opening night, Ethan beamed with pride as strangers praised his creativity and bravery. But what made him happiest was knowing that his art gave a voice to kids like him, kids who sometimes felt unheard or afraid to speak up. He often visited schools to talk about finding strength in difficult times, leaving audiences inspired by his wisdom and maturity. Together, Sarah and Ethan became advocates for open communication within families. Their workshops grew in popularity, drawing participants from all walks of life. Parents learned to listen without judgment, while children discovered the importance of expressing their feelings. Sarah often shared how Ethan's actions had saved her from making a life-altering mistake, emphasizing the value of trusting a child's instincts. "Heroes come in all shapes and sizes," she would say, looking proudly at her son. "Sometimes, they're standing right next to you." Life wasn't perfect, of course. There were still moments when sadness crept in, when Sarah missed having someone to share quiet evenings with, or when Ethan wondered what it might have been like to have a father figure he could truly trust. But they faced these challenges together, leaning on their unbreakable bond. They celebrated small victories like mastering a new recipe or finishing a challenging school project, and found comfort in the ordinary joys of life. Movie nights, long walks, and lazy Sunday mornings. One crisp autumn afternoon, as golden leaves swirled around them, Sarah and Ethan visited the park where they used to play when he was little. Sitting on a bench overlooking the pond, Sarah pulled out an old photo album. Flipping through the pages, they laughed at memories of silly faces, birthday cakes, and mismatched outfits. Toward the end, they came across a picture taken on the morning of the wedding, the last happy moment before everything changed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Do you think we'd be happy now if things had gone differently? He asked softly, his eyes fixed on the photo. Sarah thought for a moment before answering. I don't know, sweetheart, she said honestly. But I do know this. We've built something real and strong because of what happened. We didn't let fear or hurt define us. And that makes me prouder than anything. As the sun dipped, below the horizon casting a warm glow over the park, Sarah wrapped an arm around Ethan's shoulders. They sat there quietly, watching the ripples in the pond fade into stillness. Life hadn't turned out the way they had planned, but it had given them something far greater, a chance to start anew, together. And in that moment, surrounded by nature's beauty and the comfort of unconditional love, they knew they were exactly where they were meant to be.